This is Dave with Taboo Customs. In this video today, we're going to take a look at some of the things we're doing to a Dana 300 to prep it for install into our Taboo Customs Cherokee here. Now, in this video, we'll go through several things with the Dana 300. First, we'll cover some general information about the Dana 300, why we use them and why we've used them in the past. Then we're going to cover how to adapt the Dana 300 to a 700R4, as well as flip it over using the advanced adapter kit, which really isn't meant to be used as a flip kit. Then we will also go through some of the changes we'll make once we flip it over to make it still that it works correctly, and we'll go through adding a sight glass to the Dana 300 so that we can add and drain our fluids as well as know that we have enough fluid in there. So we've used Dana 300s over the years in a lot of different vehicles that we've owned and a lot of different builds that we've done. We've used them in both of the vehicles that we rock crawled with, and we've also used them in some large LS swaps where there was quite a bit of horsepower. And they've held up really well. They're a compact transfer case that can hold up to really whatever you can throw at it, from V8 power to rocks and different things. There are a few issues that we've had to deal with, but there's not very many issues compared to a lot of other transfer cases. So getting into the Dana 300 itself, we actually obviously have our input connected to the transmission. It's a cast iron case. Then you've got your rear output here that is directly in line with the input. Our speedometer output for the CJ speedometers and our original vent tube. Over here we've got our shift rods. Now the way to tell the shift rod as far as which one is front and rear, because what you do have, you have a front and you have a rear shift rod. Now the front shift rod is the one that is on the same side as the front output, and the rear is on the same side as the rear output. So it's really pretty easy to try to remember that this one's on the front and that one's on the rear. Now we do have a sensor to tell when we're in four-wheel drive, and then here is our fill plug, and in the bottom is our inspection plate and our drain plug, which will eventually turn into our vent plug once we flip it over. Okay, so now we will open this up and we'll take a look at the inside and explain how this transfer case works. Alright, so let's take a look inside the Dana 300 and see how these guys function. Now they're really kind of a simple mechanism once you do open it up. There's really three sets of gears here. You've got your set here that goes from the input to the output for the rear, which anytime you have it in two-wheel drive, that's actually what is turning. You can see there I can hold the front and we turn the rear because we are locked in the two-wheel drive. Now in between these two sets of gears here, you've got a couple of shift forks with a collar that will slide back and forth. And that's actually what you're moving whenever you're moving your shift rods, is you're sliding those collars back and forth to either put it in four-wheel drive high, four-wheel drive low, or two-wheel drive. Now here you can see we've got two sets of gears, and if you look on the output side for both the rear and the front, you can see that this gear and this gear are roughly the same size, but they're larger than this gear and this gear. And that's what tells us which gear is basically low and which is high. This is your low gear, this larger gear. And as I can, in this smaller gear is your high gear. So as I turn the input, you can see that the high gear pretty much will turn 1 to 1. It turns the same amount as the input, the output will turn. However, the low gear here will actually turn at half the speed of the input from the transfer case. So that's what shows us that is the low gear. Now when you go to put this into low or high, you're actually moving these shift forks around. And you can see on this one here that whenever I push it in, it'll actually scoot over, and now it's locked in to 4 low. We've actually went from this idler right in here over and locked on to this piece on this side to lock those two gears together. Now you can see why sometimes with the Dana 300 you have to play with it a little bit to get into gear, because you can see that this does turn at a different speed than this, so you do have to get those lined up. Now when you open these up, there'll be a couple of things to look for, and they're pretty robust, so you usually don't have a whole lot of issues, but you can look for a few things. Obviously look for wear on the gears. You know, this one looks really good. Look for any kind of chips or any kind of other issues with the gears. You can also look for the same thing on these down here, if they've had someone that's been really rough on them and possibly, you know, damaged these gears, these mesh gears down here. The other thing that I have had occur before is I have opened up one and had these little pieces down here missing, these little pieces on these forks. One of them was missing, so we don't know if it fell off or when they put it back together they didn't get it back on there right. But you know, you can look for those, and obviously look for any sign that it's had a lot of water in it, a lot of rust, then you might have some issues with bearings. Alright, so as for some of the weaknesses of the Dana 300 here, one of the main things that we usually do on these, well always do whenever we put these into our Jeeps, and we'll use them in other projects, so we swap out the yokes. The yokes that typically come with the CJ version of the Dana 300 is going to be a 1310 yoke, but it's going to be a strap style yoke. So at minimum I would recommend swapping that out to a U-bolt style yoke, because in general the U-bolt style yokes are much stronger than these strap style yokes, where you tend to see the straps and the bolts break off and shear when you use them hard. The other thing we typically do is we'll usually upgrade from a 1310 joint to a 1330, or in this case a 1350, which is what we use since we're running 1-ton axles. The other things that can kind of come up with the Dana 300 that you'll find is if you do install a Dana 300 and let's say you do twin stick it. Now the twin stick, you know, you do that so you can get, you know, two-wheel drive low to the rear, and also use your front wheel drive only in low and high. Now when you do that though, sometimes the shifting can kind of be difficult. I know when we were competing, we actually I had a process I would have to go through just to get it into two-wheel front low, which, you know, once you kind of get used to that, it's not such a big issue, but sometimes it can be a pain if you're on something that's off camber. So now we'll start talking about what it's going to take to adapt our Dana 300 to our 700R4. So we purchased an advanced adapters kit to adapt our 700R4 to our Dana 300. Now we do have a full-wheel drive 700R4, so it's a little bit simpler. We don't have to deal with converting the transmission from two-wheel drive to four-wheel drive, and we just have to deal with changing our input shaft and really adding our different housing to the rear of the transmission. So as I mentioned before, this kit and this adapter is really meant to adapt the 700R4 in a passenger side drop. However, we want to use it in a driver's side drop, so we have to flip the transfer case over. And in a little bit here, we'll show you how we have to change this adapter to be able to do that. But here we'll start out, you'll get an adapter, a new bearing that will go on the input of the transfer case, and you'll get one of the more important parts as well as the adapter is a new input shaft for the transfer case that is set up to accept the rear shaft, the output shaft out of the 700R4. And then in addition to that, you'll get your hardware and all of the instructions, as well as a new flange gasket and a new seal for your input shaft. So the first major thing we'll talk about, and that's changing your original transmission adapter out to the new adapter. Now before we do our flip though, we're gonna don't do this until you look at the flip if you are planning on flipping it, because you can't just install this and expect it to work. But if you are installing this in a passenger side drop, you can go ahead and just install this on transmission. Now one thing we wanted to point out is that one of the bigger issues that we have with this swap is actually getting this off of the transmission. If your transmission is out of the vehicle, it's pretty easy. You can get to these bolts fairly easy without all the issues. However, with ours, with the way our Cherokee is set up, it's really difficult to get to. And the problem we had is that these bolts more than likely hadn't been taken out since that had came from the factory and been put in. So those bolts were difficult to take out all the way to the last thread. So it actually took us about an hour and a half to take these 4 bolts, the 2 in the top and the 2 in the bottom. Now part of the issue is that this bolt down in here is just so close to everything down there, and on top of being in a tight space, it just took quite a while. So if you can't take your transmission out, or you're not taking your transmission out, just be prepared that those might be a pain. And to do that, to take those out, we actually had to take one of our wrenches and cut it down. So it was only about 5 inches long, and then use the box end to try to just tooth by tooth take these bottom bolts out. So they really can be a pain. Oh, so beyond changing out our adapter on our transmission, the next big item is going to be changing out our input shaft. Now to do that, we'll have to remove this assembly here. First, we'll need to remove these Allen head bolts, and they're a 3/16 Allen head. They should come out pretty easy, but after that point you might have a little bit of trouble, because this actually has a really thick flange that goes down into the transfer case, and it's somewhat of a press/slip fit. Now the instructions will tell you that there's slots here in the side that you can pry on, and if there are, it makes it a little bit easier, but on ours we don't have that. So there's no slots here, so we have to try to get a little bit of a gap here to be able to get into. So with that, I've got a dead blow hammer, because we don't want to try to hit this with a steel hammer, because this is aluminum and you will end up messing it up. So we're trying to make sure we get a little bit of space here at the top. And then what we'll use is, I like to use in these cases, wood chisels. Now, the wood chisels aren't necessarily made for steel. However, they do work well. You'll have to keep resharpening them at times. But for cases like this, they're a lot thinner, so you can, and they've got a really good angle here, or a very narrow angle, really a very small angle, to try to start to pull that away from that face. So just do a little bit and move to another area. Like I said, it's pretty much a slip fit down in that transfer case, so you'll have to move around a lot. So now we're getting to the point to where our chisel is actually bottoming out on the diameter of the inside. So try to get a little bit more space here. Just keep working back and forth, little by little, 1/16 at a time. Important step. And then we'll continue prying that out. I swear it'll come out eventually. So if you had a partner to hold the transfer case instead of holding the camera, it'd be a little bit easier. Just saying. So like I said, 1/16 at a time. Go back and forth until finally, try not to lose all the bolts, you'll pop it out. So see, what we've got here now is we've got our input shaft, that housing that has the bearing and the seal in it. We've got the first gear that we showed you on the inside. This is the gear that the sleeve slides over to lock things into. This would be, well, either 4-wheel drive or 2-wheel drive high. And then we've got a snap ring on top here. Alright, so the next step on the input assembly here is we'll have to take this snap ring off. make sure you have a good set of snap ring pliers. If you have those smaller sets, this larger snap ring can sometimes be a pain in the butt, but the snap ring should come off pretty easily. Now, one of the things that can be difficult on the rest of this is getting this gear off. The instructions say, you know, just pull it off, but it doesn't just pull off. You have to pry it off. Now, there's a couple ways you can get it off. If you have one of those like bearing pullers that you can slide in there, that has long bolts through it, those would help, and I looked for mine for a while and I couldn't find them. So back to something a little bit more rudimentary. And that again is going back to my wood chisels. I don't know, I just have a thing about wood chisels, I guess. But again, they're, you know, large flat surface here. We can kind of use it to pry that bearing off, which easier said than done. Now, if you do that, you do not want to just go at it real hard from one side. Again, work back and forth. Alright, so eventually we had to go over, put it in a vise so we could get a little bit more leverage on it, because we weren't able to hold it ourselves and pry up. I mean, we are finally, well, I did have it coming off. Yeah, once you start to get it coming off, you can start prying on the bottom part there, and it's basically just a you know, shaft there. That once you get it off, take this back over here. Now we have another ring that we have to take out of this. On the inside here, there's a ring on the outside of this this aluminum piece, so I'll have to grab that, start to pull that off. The easiest way to do that is with a couple screwdrivers, but I only have one on me here, so I'll try to get it out. I'll have to grab another one. Okay. So if you can pry this out here, and it probably would help if we still had in our vise, but we took it out. Basically get the small screwdriver back in there behind it, and now we can start to pull that ring out. Okay, so we've got that ring out. Now this bearing is also pressed in here, so now you may have to take this over to an actual press and press this out, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to take it over to our little shop press, flip it over, press this shaft out through the bottom, which will pull that bearing with it. So now that we've pressed our shaft and our original bearing out, we'll need to do a few things. We'll need to replace this seal in here, so we'll go over and we'll knock that out and put a new seal in a second, and then we'll need to press the new bearing onto the shaft, and then we'll have to press that whole assembly into here and replace our ring. So let's take care of that seal. We'll go over to our vise. Need to knock out the old seal from the inside. Okay, so now that we've got our new seal in place, we'll go back over the press. We'll press this onto here, and then we'll press everything back into the housing. Alright, so we've pressed the shaft onto the bearing. We hand pressed it down into the housing here, but it doesn't go all the way, so we're going to have to press it farther down. Now, it's kind of difficult to do that because you need to support the housing somehow, and then press on this bearing. You don't really want to press on the shaft really, because the shaft's actually pressed onto the bearing, so you don't want to press it out of the bearing. So we've got a large piece of tube here. We're used pretty much lines up with the inside of our bearing, and then we'll press that bearing down the rest of the way into the housing. Alright, now with everything pressed together, we want to make sure to put the ring back inside the groove around the bearing. Just a little flat screwdriver for that. Just try to make sure it doesn't pop back out. Then we'll need to put the gear back on the shaft, and be sure to put the snap ring back in here to hold it all together. So that pretty much does it for the assembly of the new shaft. We're going to go and we're going to clean this up because it got a little dirty. Then we're going to go and we're going to clean up this flange. You can see where there's a little bit of RTV on it. I do recommend putting a little RTV on this flange and then reassembling it back into the transfer case. Now, a big thing when you do go put it back into the transfer case, before you start pushing it into the transfer case, make sure that your holes are lined up, because once you get it in there, it's going to be real hard to turn this. So make sure that as much as you can, as much as possible, you can make sure your holes are lined up so it doesn't cause you problems trying to put the bolts back in. So now we're going to start talking about some of the changes we're going to have to make to flip this over. And we'll talk about some of the changes with the adapter we'll have to make, and then changes to the transfer case in general. We'll start with some of the simple ones first. You know, right now this is what originally was the top of the transfer case. So the biggest, one thing here is going to be the breather was obviously on top in the past. So we actually, in flipping this transfer case around, knocked this breather out. You have to be careful because this breather is a little tube that's steel, however it goes into an aluminum case, so you can knock that out pretty easily, and we actually did. What we will do is, now since the threads are now stripped in this, the threads in here I believe are typically 3/8 fine thread. So if you have a fine thread 3/8 bolt, you can thread that bolt back in there, or in our case we're actually going to use a coarse thread bolt so we can cut some new threads. Now what we'll do is we'll go and we'll take RTV, we will RTV these threads so as it cuts down in there we don't get any chips to get, we can kind of capture those chips and it should glue them in place. But even at that, we shouldn't have too much that causes us an issue. Now if we were using the fine thread bolt, we would do the same thing. We put some RTV on it, seal it up, because now this is going to be the bottom and we don't want that to leak. So with the bolt here, you have a good distance before you're going to run into any of the internal pieces here in this tail shaft section of the transfer case. So length shouldn't really be an issue, but I would try to stay as short as possible. A couple of the other things, this was the fill plug. That's actually now going to be the drain plug once we flip it over. And then later on in this video, we'll show you how we're going to go in and we're going to add a new fill plug up here. And then we're actually going to add a sight glass, which isn't really required. Now, another option, if you don't want to drill and put a new plug in here for a fill, is you could fill it through the original drain plug. Now, this is kind of difficult because usually what we will do is we'll go in here and we'll add a fitting and make that the new vent. Now, you can fill the transfer case through that. However, it's going to take you a little while because the hole is pretty small and you're not really going to know where your level is at. So you kind of have to watch how much you put into it. We will have to make one major modification to the transfer case to run it flipped. Not necessarily required, but usually is required for clearance and different things. And that is, we're going to need to cut this section of this aluminum housing off. Now, there's nothing really inside of here except this is what was holding the transfer case shifter in the original vehicle. So we're going to go in here in a second. We'll cut this off and we'll show you where we cut it off. Now, we're cutting it off for two main reasons. One, clearance for everything below the Jeep, and then two, to actually clear our adapter at the back of the transfer case. Now, normally, as I said, this is a transfer case adapter that's meant to be used when the transfer case is not flipped. So it will fit on there without the transfer case flipped, and this is the normal configuration you'd have it in. However, when we go to flip the transfer case, see, we actually hit this bracket with our adapter from Advanced Adapters. Now, I can't remember if the Novak adapter had the same issue. I've used the Novak adapters as well, but we always just cut this off anyway, so it wasn't an issue that I knew of. But we will have to cut it off to make sure we get clearance for that before we start talking about some modifications we'll have to make to the adapter itself. Alright, so we've gone in, we've cut this bracket off. So what we did is we took a hard wheel, we cut along the two sides here, and then we flipped it over and we took a hammer and we just hit this bottom side to break off this back edge. Just make sure you get as far through these sides as you can so that you can weaken that enough to break it off pretty easily. Now we'll go in, clean this up, and then repaint everything so it looks black again. But that is how we remove that. You could also possibly, use a bandsaw, a portable bandsaw, or a sawzall, something like that to cut this off. Either one would work. Just make sure you don't get into the areas where your shift rods are going through that aluminum assembly. You don't want to get into there and mess anything up. Okay, so now we'll talk about the adapter and how we're going to have to modify it. Now, as I said, the adapter is really made to be put on the transfer case, in close to that configuration. However, we're going to now flip it over where this is on the bottom. So this piece will need to be towards the bottom. Now, for the most part, the adapter will fit like that. However, there are two holes that will not line up with the original bolt pattern. That is these holes here, which will now be on the top of the transfer case, or be originally the bottom two holes in this. Now, with the Advanced Adapters adapter, we have two sets of holes. Now, if we use one set of holes, we would actually have to notch out this hole here and here to be able to hit these two bolts up here. However, for our use, we're going to want to run this transfer case as flat as possible. Our Cherokee is fairly low, it's not real high, so we want this transfer case flat, and to keep our ground clearance at most we can. So we are actually going to use the other set of holes where we're going to have to take out this center section of this and basically make this a slot. So to do that, we're going to go in. First, we're going to drill as big a drill as we can through here without trying to walk off. So probably be about a 3/16, maybe a 1/4 inch drill bit running through there. And then we're going to take a little die grinder bit and we're going to go in and clean up this slot and make it as clean as possible so that we can get clearance to these two bolt holes here in the center. Alright, so we've modified the adapter, we've gone in, we've added our slots. So these adapters are aluminum. It is a little bit of a pain to work with. Since it's a soft material, if you're going in with something like your high-speed die grinder, these bits tend to get loaded up. So we spent a lot of time trying to clean up our loaded up bits. Once you do get fairly close to a slot in there, what you can do is take a drill and run it back and use that to actually get it to the right size. Because these need to be a 3/8 slot, it's a lot easier with the drill and basically working it back and forth, continuing to clean those up until you can fit a 3/8 bolt through there. Now, one thing you'll need to watch for is once you get that done, you're going to want to test fit it. A lot of times when you slot these two holes, you end up going straight across when this is actually should be kind of in a radius here. So a lot of times you need a little extra material taken out of the top side, this outside edge of these slots, to be able to clear the bolt. So once you get that done, definitely make sure that you test fit. Once you figure out where you're going, make sure you test fit it. And so now you can see how those bolts are now in the middle of our slots there now that we flipped this over. And really that should be the only modification we have to make for this to be able to use it as a flip kit. Now obviously someone out there is going to go, okay, you went and you slotted that, now it's not as strong as it was. Correct. It's not as strong as it was. Is it strong enough? I would say yes. We've done this modification several times, and over the last 12 years we've been running rigs that have this modification done either on an advanced adapter or a Novak adapter. So we've done this several times. There still is definitely enough strength in here to maintain its structural integrity. So we've never had an issue. Not to say that it couldn't be an issue, because you are correct. Doing this with the slotted hole would be a little bit weaker. But make sure you get your clamping force on those bolts, and it should hold up well. So now that we've got that modification done, we'll pop this off and talk about one of the last things here for the considerations when we're flipping it. And of course, it's going to be a pain coming off. Alright, so the last thing we want to talk about when we're talking about going and flipping this is now obviously our shift rods are on the bottom side. So we've got to figure out a way to shift this transfer case. Typically what we will use is we will use a cable shifter, and we haven't decided yet whether we're going to just go buy a cable shifter. We've used several different brands of cable shifters in the past. I think Northwest Fab was the last one we used, and it was a good cable shifter. Or if we're going to design our own, we've done that as well in the past too. So we haven't decided, but one of the things we recommend is a good cable shifter so that you can shift this transfer case as easily as possible. And that pretty much does it for the flip information. Next up, we'll take a look at adding the sight glass to the back of the transfer case. Alright, so the last part of the video here, we're going to cover the installation of our sight glass tube kit in the Dana 300. We do offer a sight glass tube kit, and we'll actually have a separate video that goes through that in a little bit more detail, so we're just going to kind of hit the gist of it here. Now the kit does include the tube, a couple of pneumatic fittings, push to lock fittings that you'll need, an adapter. It'll also come with the drill bit and the tap. So with this, it's pretty easy install. Now the main reason we're adding this is that we do need to add a fill port up here, because now that we flipped the transfer case over, our old drain port that was on the cover really won't be able to be used as a fill port unless we want to try to fill it through the vent line, which I have done in the past and it's kind of a pain. So we'll add this new fill port, and then we'll also be able to add and make sure that we can see, you know, how much fluid is actually in the transfer case. Now the bottom part of this is pretty simple. You'll take out the old fill plug. We've got a reducer adapter here that'll come. Now when you install this, you're going to make sure you need to put thread tape or some other sealant to seal this up. You can install that plug, and then you'll install the next, the fitting here. Now the fitting already has sealant on it, so we will install that in a bit, because the first thing we really have to do, and the main thing about this addition, is we're going to have to drill and tap a hole up here. Alright, so the area we're going to drill and tap is going to be somewhere in this area right in here. Now I typically shoot for, there's a little box right here. I'll typically shoot for the middle of that box and then just the bottom edge of it, because typically there is a little bit of a lip there that you can kind of catch with the drill bit. Now what we'll do is we'll go in, we'll center punch that spot. Now if you'd like, you can take a smaller drill bit, 1/8 inch drill bit or something like that, go in there, drill that a little bit just to make your center punch a little bit larger. Then once we get everything punched, we need to start to prep to be able to do the drilling. Now what you're going to want to do is you want to take a rag, put it on the inside, make sure that it's up against the side of the transfer case. You don't want any chips to fall down inside the transfer case. Then we're going to take some grease, and we're actually going to grease up our drill bit a little bit here, so that whenever we're drilling this, any chips that do come off, hopefully we can get them to stick to the drill bit instead of being pushed into the case, and we'll be able to keep that from getting any chips inside. So being cast iron, it's not too difficult to drill. A little bit hard in that area, trying to do it like that. You might end up wanting to add more grease, clean off the bit every now and then. Just make sure that you're square as possible to the transfer case. So as I know now, I'm starting to get through the transfer case. And honestly, I probably should have grabbed another rag to clean that off in, but I don't have one. We're in the middle of the video, so. So now we've gotten through the transfer case. We didn't get too many chips down inside. Most of it comes to the outside, but again, just make sure that you do get all those chips. One thing you can do that I didn't do here is you could smear the inside with a little bit of grease. That way anything that does fall through, a lot of times we get caught in that grease, so that you can clean up that area. Thank you. So now, clean up our grease. And same thing with the tap. We'll take the tap, and this time we will smear some grease on the inside. And we will cover the tap with some grease. And then we'll get our tap started. And the main thing is just trying to get it perpendicular to the surface. So just make sure you go kind of slow at the beginning. square as possible. And once you kind of get it where you can, where you know you're getting threads starting to be cut, you know, just make sure you support the end of it so it doesn't, as you turn this, it doesn't want to pull that tap up. And it should be fairly easy to tap it. The cast iron will drill fairly easy and it'll tap fairly easy. Alright, so we've pretty much got this whole tap. We'll remove it, clean everything up, and then we'll start installing the rest of the kit. Alright, so we've drilled and tapped our hole and we cleaned it out, and it's pretty easy to keep debris out of the inside. Just make sure that you take your time as you go to pull that rag out and not let anything fall inside. What I actually did was took my finger and smeared it in grease again, and then kind of just went in there and dabbed around to grab all the little pieces that had fallen, you know, next to the rag. Make sure we kept it clean. So I've gone in, I've installed our reducer in our new bottom here. We've installed these push-to-lock fitting, well, one of the push-to-lock fittings, and then we'll install the tube and the other push-to-lock fitting. So first we'll go ahead and install the fitting. Perhaps. Now we did also clean the threads before we installed this, because we might make sure any debris that was in there was cleaned out as well. You don't want to, you know, push it into the case with the threads or get it caught in the threads there and cause any kind of leaking issues or other threading issues. So as it gets this tight, these fittings will swivel, so you don't have to worry necessarily about at what angle that fitting is at. Then we'll take our tube. The way these work is push it in all the way into the fitting, and you can see you can't pull it out now. And eventually, when you do need to pull it out, you push down on the little ring, and it pulls right out. So you put it in, and then you can measure for the length that you're going to need. So these tubes, if we measure down here, they'll go in about a ½ inch. So they basically go in all the way down to the bottom edge of that fitting, which is pretty much up here. So we're going to want to cut this tube off about right there. And you're going to want to push and give yourself a little bit of slack so you can make sure you get it in there with a good clean, you know, seal. Now we'll just use a set of diagonal cutters to go in and cut this tube. Alright, just make sure you cut it as square as possible. Now when you do cut it, there's a good chance you're going to have a little bit, it's going to kind of oval, just kind of flatten it back out. And take it and make sure you get that tube pushed in as far as you can. Now when it's pushed in correctly, if you pull on it, you should not be able to pull that tube back out at all. You see, so now we've got our sight glass here. You know, if you want, you can make it longer and bring it up in an S shape, you know, if you wanted to try to clear for this, but more than likely if you're going to remove this, you're going to remove this stuff anyway. Now we give you a little bit extra, and the reason for that is, you know, you can run a little bit different scenarios with the tube, but also so that when you want to fill the case, you can pull this ring up, pull this tube out, and then use a quart bottle, stick this on the end, and you can just put this into the upper fitting so that you have something that's a little bit flexible to be able to fill that with. And when we fill it, we typically will put 2 quarts of 80-90 weight in it and then see where we're at. You want to make sure that, you know, in whatever orientation you have your transfer case, that all of the bearings, you know, are at least, I would say, you know, half to 2/3 covered in oil. If you're any less than that, then you're going to run the risk possibly of leaking some out and then starving your bearings. And being that, you know, in some cases this will be high speed, you know, that's typically where a bearing would lock up due to heat, due to not having that oil. So anyway, just make sure that you get enough oil in it, And then obviously now with the sight glass, you can monitor it and make sure that it does stay up to par. As I mentioned earlier, our sight glass tubes are available on taboocustoms.com, so you can go there if you'd like to purchase one. Well, thanks for watching the video. That's going to do it for our upgrades on the Dana 300 here. In the future, we'll probably have some other videos because we're going to do some different upgrades, you know, some changing the shifting from the bottom to the top, as well as some other things that we might do on another project that we do have. So thanks for watching. If you've liked the video, please like or subscribe us. You can also find us on Facebook, or you can contact us on taboocustoms.com if you have any further questions or want further details about what we've gone through today. So thanks again.